All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, that's better. All right. I hope you enjoyed the feast on the First Amendment. I thought it was a blast. I think we almost got everything in. We may have missed one thing, or two. We may try to get those in tonight if we can. But overall, I think things are going pretty well. A reminder, this session will last an hour. Adam's going to talk for 45 minutes, then he'll have 15 minutes of questions and answer. Please take advantage of that. He's also going to tell you about some literature in the back, plus, of course, we have Amnesty International literature in the back, too. Mary, do you want to say something? No, you're just counting. Go ahead. Okay. And is Dylan here yet? He's still breaking stuff down. Dylan will have his petition to make the university the entire university a free speech zone, which is sort of what Adam's going to be hitting on. We're really fortunate today in this afternoon session, and we'll have actually three, in addition to Adam Kissel and Padala. We also are going to have a roundtable discussion at 4:45 on Snyder versus Phelps, and Adam will participate in that. Gene Polizinski, Frank Lamonte, and Jeff Hunt, who was our wonderful speaker last night. So I'm going to get away from here and let Adam Kissel, who works for thefire.org, a wonderful organization, and I think we really have great organizations represented here this year. And Adam got his undergraduate degree at Harvard and his law degree, is that the law degree? Graduate degree, okay, at the University of Chicago. And he's what we call in the business ABD, which means all but done with his dissertation, and I think he's doing such good work in what he's doing. He doesn't even ever finish that dissertation until he's ready to retire. So anyway, we'll turn it on over to Adam, and we're so fortunate to have him here in the state of Iowa today. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming.
Thanks. There are a lot of people to thank because there are so many co-sponsors for First Amendment Day, so I'm not going to be able to hit even one or two more than I have. But David Bulla and the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication have been so important to this for me. And it's great to see Amnesty International here, too, because, you know, as bad as you might think things are for journalists in the United States or free speech in the United States, things are actually much worse in the rest of the world, not everywhere else in the world. But one thing that we say in the United States is that instead of killing each other, we kill each other's ideas. And I get that out of a great book by Jonathan Rauch called Kindly Inquisitors. And the idea in the United States is that we have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, not because the government has given those rights to us, but because those are the essential principles of individual liberty and human dignity. We have them because we're human beings, and if we exercise them, we're doing something special as rational human beings, sometimes irrational human beings too. And when you choose to go to college, who here is a high school student and who's a college student? High school students first, and then college students, and then lifelong learners? Okay. When you choose to go to college, you're doing something even more special than just being a citizen. You are spending the first 4, 5, 6, or 7 years of your life learning liberty, learning how to be a citizen, disciplining your mind to be the kind of person who can take your place in society at a higher level than you would have if you had not gone to college. And almost every university in the country that is not simply a sectarian one that you go to in order to get indoctrinated actually advertises to you, come to our school to think your best thoughts, to really figure out who you are, come to college to figure out your political beliefs, figure out your religious beliefs, maybe change your mind 4 or 5 times along the way, and do that in a community of other people who are together with you, figuring out who you are and what your political beliefs are and what your religious and social and environmental and every other kind of belief that is important to you is. And what that also means is that during that time, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes. You're going to say, I can't believe how dumb I was when I was 17. And then when you're 19, you say, I can't believe how dumb I was when I was 18. And then when you're 25, you say, I can't believe how dumb I was through my whole college experience. And if you continue to have those experiences, then it shows that you are really thinking through who you are and what you believe at a level that a lot of people never get to. And if you're really getting a good education, you should be giving yourself that freedom to make mistakes and really try something out, figure it out, and maybe fail and then try again. And you're doing that in a community of other people who are also disciplining your minds to really get good at reading and writing and thinking at a high level. And you're doing something really at an elite level because not only do people not always go to college, you have lots of high school dropouts and you have a lot of high school graduates who go somewhere else other than college, but even in college, a lot of you don't finish. What do you think the 4-year graduation rate is here at Iowa State? Who gets out after 4 years? 35%. Who gets out after 6 years? The 6-year graduation rate, 70%. So still, 1 out of every 3 people is still here after 6 years. So if you're a high school student and you're thinking you're going to be on the 4-year plan, a lot of you are not. And that's just the fact of it. So what does that mean? I'm not trying to beat up on ISU because that's actually kind of normal numbers compared to the rest of the country. But I'm saying that over the next 4 or 5, 6 or 7 years, once you enter as a freshman, that's your young adult life right there. That's where you are figuring out what you're going to be like for the rest of your life and what your political beliefs are and all the rest of your beliefs. And this is your chance to learn liberty and learn appreciation for the First Amendment and being the kind of best human being you can be, or to unlearn liberty and to learn the opposite, where people tell you that you need to be protected from hurtful speech, that you can't be empowered and stand up for yourself. And almost every university in the country at least promises to you that come to our university, you can be anything you want to be. You can join any one of 400 different student organizations across the spectrum of every kind of issue, and you can take electives, you can take courses and develop your interests in all kinds of different ways. That's the kind of place we are. That's what we are as a liberal arts university. You're not in college just to get away from your parents, which might be part of the story. You might be not just trying to get a job, but you're trying to do something special. You're trying to do really something so that you are learning how to be a citizen in society, or if you're an international student, to have that development so that you go back or stay and feel that you understand what it is to be a rational human being at this higher level. And so that's kind of my model and what kind of the ideal model of higher education is in a liberal arts setting. And so in order to do that really well, you have to have that freedom to make mistakes. You have to be able to say, you know, I'm still disciplining my mind, and I'm still trying to figure out what counts as good evidence and what counts as good counter evidence, and when I should change my mind, how strong the evidence should be, and how should my emotions play into that. You're having all of those rhetorical conversations with yourself about what's a good argument. So you're going to make lots of mistakes, and that's kind of what's expected. You're paying a lot of money to be able to make those mistakes in an environment where you have intellectual freedom, you have intellectual humility, and you have academic freedom so that you can write a bunch of papers and think a bunch of thoughts, have bull sessions in the dorms or over meals, and really get something out of the college experience that is worth the money that you're paying, not just getting a job. So when you're making all those mistakes, what's going to happen? You're going to have these bull sessions and say all kinds of things that might be false, or that might be offensive to other people, or might be offensive to yourself after you think about it the next day. Or it comes out of your mouth and you say, oh, I guess I shouldn't have said that. So then what should happen? Should the person who feels offended, or you yourself, submit yourself to the authorities, to the university, and say, uh-oh, I just offended someone, or have someone else say, this person was so offensive that idea just has no place on a college campus. We can't have anything like that around here. So do you go to the university administration to be mom and dad and protect you from harmful or hurtful ideas? Or do you empower yourself to say to the person who offended you, hey, offensive person, hey, jerk, why did you say that awful, stupid, jerky thing to me, right? And really be able to feel that empowerment to talk back to that person and say, as much as I hate your idea, I'm going to try to persuade you to not have that idea anymore. I'm not going to try to get you in trouble for that idea. I'm not going to call on mom and dad and the administration to protect me from you. I don't need to be protected from you unless you're really harassing me, unless you're really intimidating me, unless you're really threatening me. Okay, maybe I need the police to come in if you're really threatening me. But if it's the rough and tumble of normal everyday life where people have hard things to say at hard debates, if you can't handle that, almost every university also has lots of empowerment resources for you, right? So if you hear someone say a strong challenge of your political beliefs, your religion, or part of your identity that's really important to you, your race or your gender or some other thing that really matters to you, and you find that you can't talk back, and you just feel like you're shutting down, whereas the average person next to you would have been able to respond. The problem is not so much the person who offended you, although it might still be a moral problem for them that they said the offensive thing. But part of the problem might still be that you need to empower yourself to be able to say, all right, a reasonable person could have been able to say, stop being a jerk. Right? And then you have some other options, right? So fighting bad speech with better speech is part of the academic mission. You have this interplay of ideas, and you have the idea that, well, the idea that I hate might actually be right, and I have the intellectual humility to actually listen to what that person's saying. This comes out of John Stuart Mill's great little book called On Liberty. The idea that I hate might actually be right, so I'll listen. Or the idea that I hate might be partly right and partly wrong. So I still need to listen and try to figure out, along with this other person, if they're willing to talk about it with me, what part do they have that's right and what part do they have that's wrong. And that can sound really difficult if you just really solidly hate their ideas. Or the idea that you hate might really be completely wrong, but them confronting you with their idea and you confronting them back with yours gives you a great opportunity to, again, think through the quality of evidence, think through what counter-evidence is, and be able to know and make your own, and make up your own mind, make up for yourself the ideas that you have and the ideas that you're going to believe and carry with you later in life. Even the dust at your feet, says Mill, or maybe Milton now, I forget which one is which, because there's a great book by Milton, too, about freedom of the press, Areopagitica, which I recommend to you. Even the dust at your feet is good for shining your shoes, right? Even the worst idea in the world is worth something to help you sharpen up your mind to know how wrong it is. And so if someone tells you, oh, some idea just has no place on a college campus, that's just beyond the pale, that's beyond the bounds of civil discourse. Your response should be, well, no, that idea does have a place. It may not have a very big place, but it has enough of a place that someone thought to say it, and now it's our job to confront it. So my feeling about higher education has kind of these noble goals. And so if you really want to make your campus a free speech zone, if you really want to make your campus that kind of a place, you need that kind of buy-in with university professors and administrators and fellow students, so that when something offensive happens on campus, you can have people rise up and say, we don't need to punish that person necessarily. Instead, we need to fight bad speech with better speech. And as a community, we can do that ourselves. And social pressure works really well. If somebody's a jerk to someone else in such a bad way that all their friends start saying, hey, you were a jerk, stop being that way, that's actually pretty effective to get the jerk to stop being a jerk most of the time. You don't really need to punish that person and get them out of the way, because they're not really going to learn their lesson that way. So part of improving the case for free speech and academic freedom on campus really is that cultural shift, that buy-in, that, hate speech is free speech too, that hurtful speech is free speech too, up to a point. And almost all speech is free speech too. And we know what to do when we're offended. We know what to do when someone is saying something that's really awful. And we know what to do when someone's saying something that we disagree with, instead of calling on the university to punish it. It turns out that you have more free speech rights on the public sidewalk than you have at a public university. You lose your rights, your free speech rights. You don't actually lose them, but the university speech codes tell you that you lose them. So on the one hand, the university says, come and you can be anything you want to be. Even at a private university like Yale, they say you can come here and think the unthinkable, mention the unmentionable. This is the kind of place we are. So on the one hand, they make those promises. They induce you to show up, saying, come to our liberal arts university. And on the other hand, they have these speech codes. And 2/3 of American universities in our database, we have about 400 of them that we analyze every year, are unconstitutional. 2/3 of the campus speech policies are unconstitutional. And we could explain to you why we have a guide called Correcting Common Mistakes in Campus Speech Policies, because there are so many mistakes. They fall into similar categories. And my organization, at thefire.org, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, has been fighting speech codes and fighting abuses of free speech in practice for almost 12 years now. And we're completely nonpartisan. So what that means is one day we might be defending the students who brought Bill Ayers to campus, and the next day, the students who brought David Horowitz to campus. And one day, the students who are advocating for very conservative values. And the next day, students who are advocating for very progressive values. And the next day, somebody who just ticked off a professor or ticked off a administrator and then got in trouble for disturbing the peace. Or swore, and someone didn't like hearing someone cursing around campus and tried to get that person in trouble. And sometimes it's ideological, sometimes it's a matter of power. And sometimes it's just a bureaucrat who needs to show lots of prosecutions to show that they're doing a good job solving some big problem on campus by showing that they're, for instance, solving the sexual harassment problem on campus. So if you show lots of prosecutions for sexual harassment, whether the people have been harassed or not, then you're showing that you're solving a problem, you're doing something good. But before we get into ISU's unconstitutional policies, let's talk about some examples. How are some of the schools that are public universities in the United States actually defending free speech rights on campus? And I almost always like to start with this case at Valdosta State University in Georgia. The case was a student was very upset that the president had announced that 2 new parking garages were going to be built on campus. He was an environmentalist. He didn't like the idea of parking garages. Parking garages bring more cars to campus instead of inviting people to find other ways to get to campus. More parking garages just draws in more cars, and that's a $25 or $30 million project that could have been, that you could have spent that money on something else. Now, FIRE, we don't take a position on that. We don't know whether that's better or worse for the world or society or for the particulars of Valdosta State, but we do know that he completely had a right to advocate for his position. So he puts up his posters advocating against the new parking garages. The president finds out about it, summons him into the president's office and says, "Who are you threatening my parking garages? This is going to be my legacy here at Valdosta State parking garages, and you, some student, cannot be threatening them." And so the student felt pretty upset, intimidated really by the president of the university saying, "You got to take your posters down." And so he did. But then he thought about it. Oh, by the way, he had also been contacting Board of Trustees members politely. And so that's when the president really hears about it. Some Board of Trustees member calls up the president and says, "We have some student advocating against something that you're doing. What's going on with that?" And presidents don't really like to get calls like that from the Board of Trustees. They like to have that nice feeling where everybody's always getting along. So I think that was part of it too. And so the president was hearing about it. But the student thought about it after he got home, after he took his posters down, and thought, this cannot be right. I cannot be intimidated into silence on the issue that I really, really care about. So he made a Facebook collage. He used Microsoft Paint and pretty primitive program, but he put a bunch of images together. One of them was a parking garage, and one of them was a gas mask, some other environmental imagery. And at the top of it, he put President Zachariah Memorial Parking Garage, kind of making fun of the idea that it was the president's legacy. And the president found out about this too. I doubt that this was in 2007, and he was maybe 70 years old. So I doubt that he had his own Facebook page, but someone probably printed it out for him, and it said, here's the collage that some student made. It has your name on it. And by the way, there was an ad. You know how there are Facebook ads? And the ad was for a photography contest. It said, "Get it, shoot it, get famous." Now, this was maybe a few months after the Virginia Tech shootings. And the president either came up with a great pretext or honestly felt, and it's hard to know which, that he saw "Get it, shoot it, get famous" in an ad. He didn't really know what it was. It was a Facebook ad, but he didn't really know. And he saw Memorial Parking Garage, and he put 2 and 2 together and got 6 and thought, this must be a death threat. Memorial means I must be dead. He must be trying to get me. So he gets his behavioral intervention team together. And in 2007, they didn't really have behavioral intervention teams. But he gets the dean of students and a bunch of other university administrators together and says, what can we do about this student? I think he's trying to threaten my life on Facebook. And they all say, this is just Facebook, and he's really not threatening your life. And the president says, no, there's got to be something. Find his medical records. We need to see if he's a danger. So they produce the medical records, and they find out from his psychiatrist he's been treated for something else. He's never been a danger to himself or others. The president says, find out his religion. We need to find out what's going on with this guy. They find out he's a Buddhist pacifist. That doesn't help. So he calls up the Board of Regents, top lawyer of the state of Georgia, in the Board of Regents and says, what can I feel like we need to expel this student. What can I do? And the head lawyer says, you can't do anything. You're going to be violating his freedom of speech and his due process rights if you just expel him with no notice and no hearing, and you just slide a note under his door saying you're expelled. Well, the story basically ends with that actually happening. The president had someone slide a note under the student's door saying, I, President Zakari, have declared you a clear and present danger to the campus, and you are administratively withdrawn from the campus, basically being expelled. And stapled to it is the Facebook collage. So a pretty blatant violation of the student's rights. Not only was it retaliation from the president against everyone else's advice, saying you're going to be violating his rights if you do it, but also his due process rights. In college, you have a right to your education because you're paying for it. You have a liberty interest and a property interest. You have due process rights in your education. You can't be suspended or expelled with no notice and no hearing. You deserve at least some kind of notice, some kind of hearing, and whatever due process rights are promised to you contractually in the student handbook. In a lot of jurisdictions, the student handbook is a contract. You are induced to agree to these rules. And so how many people have actually read your student handbook, student code of conduct? Right? 2, maybe 3. Right? This is the regime that you live under for, as I've said, say 6 years of your life. These are the laws and the rules you live under. And so if there are speech codes in your code of student conduct, you would want to know about them. You'd want to know what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say without facing discipline. Let me give you some other examples. Since I may be on TV, I won't swear when I get to the part about swearing. Another case out of Georgia, University of Georgia. They actually have the speech police in the dorms. I mean that literally. So RAs, resident assistants, are trained that if they see something written in the dorms on the outside of a student's dorm room on one of those whiteboard, dry erase boards, if they see something that's written that might be offensive to other people on the floor, they are required to call in the University of Georgia police, who then actually come and investigate and then figure out who put the offensive stuff or potentially offensive stuff on the whiteboard, make sure it's wiped off, and write a police report. And the reason we know this is because we have some of the police reports. So this actually happens. And some of the things are just, crazy. And universities have bias incident response teams that spring into action when there are offensive or supposedly offensive things that happen on campus. They're the first responders, they say. We're going to come in with the police and figure out this offensive. No, okay, so what are some of the things that actually get reported as bias incidents? In the Claremont colleges, I believe it was, someone had written, "I like rice," on an Asian American student's dry erase board. Do a big investigation. They find out the student wrote it on her own whiteboard, just to be funny. Here's another one out of from the University of Georgia that we know. Someone had drawn a picture of, I'll just call it a phallic symbol with flames coming out of it, and at the top it said "fire crotch." That was what someone drew on the whiteboard. Right, this is what freshmen put on the whiteboards. It's just what you do, not what everybody does. Again, there's a difference between high-value speech and low-value speech, but the government's not going to make that decision for you and decide what should be punished. So the police come in, and you have to take a photograph of it because that's what the RAs are supposed to do, and they show the police, yes, this really said "fire crotch," and there was this picture with the flames coming out of it, and that's one of the police reports. So, again, who are these residence life people thinking that they're solving some big problem on campus by bringing in the police to show the students that they need to not do this kind of thing and be protected from one another's whiteboard expression, right? That just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't pass the laugh test, right? Now, there are plenty of other important things that you can do as an RA or residence life staff to help promote better speech rather than worse speech. And a lot of universities do have these kinds of codes of civility or community creed. But when you think about it, thinking about what I said at the beginning, should the university hand you all of your values on the first day of orientation and say, you have come to a certain kind of community, here's your values, and if you violate them, you're going to be punished? Or do they say, these are the values we would like you to have. We trust in our education so much that by the time you graduate, we think you're going to have these values too. If you mess up a few times, that's okay. We'll help you. If you want to have these values and feel you just fell short, we'll help educate you. If you don't want to have these values, that's fine, but you better make your values your own. Don't have them just because we handed them to you or because you grew up with them. You might change your mind a lot of times, and at the end of your college experience, you end up having all the same values you came in with, but you'll know them a million times better. Right? Think of how different that is between being handed the community creed and saying you're going to be punished and saying, we trust in our education, and here's the community creed that is going to be your creed by the time you graduate, if we do our job well as educators. Right? If you go to BYU or you go to a Christian college or a sectarian college of any kind, the goal of that education is to indoctrinate you in the faith that that school is teaching. If you're not indoctrinated, you should ask for your money back, right? There's a dress code, there's a speech code. That's what you've signed up for. If you go to a liberal arts university, if you're not offended all the time, having all of those hard conversations, that's when you should ask for your money back. You should try to be in all of those conversations where you actually feel offended a little bit, where you actually start to feel that emotion of, wait, I need to really defend myself here. If you're not doing that frequently, if you're just surrounding yourself with the people who believe what you believe, I don't know if you were out at the festival just a few hours ago, and if you weren't going up to the atheist group saying, well, why are you an atheist? And then coming back to you and saying, well, why are you not an atheist? And really having that give and take. If you're not actually taking advantage of those opportunities to know your own beliefs better and maybe change your mind, you're not really getting that education. So administrative officials are almost working at cross purposes to the faculty, trying to teach you things with the force of discipline that they should be trying to persuade you instead. All right, one more set of examples. IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. There is a student employee who was a janitor, and he was reading books on his work breaks. He liked history books. He would either get them out of the library or buy them himself. He'd read books on his work breaks. And at one point, he was reading a book called Notre Dame versus the Klan. And it's about how Notre Dame students in the 1920s beat up a bunch of Klansmen in a street riot. And the Notre Dame students basically won, and the Klansmen basically got beaten up. And it's basically a pro-Klan book. And he was reading about the history of this. And a black coworker of his who was in the break room with him saw the cover of the book. And you can imagine the cover of the book is on the same topic. So there's Klansmen on the cover with burning crosses, evoking the actual idea of how bad the Klansmen were. And she saw the book, judged it by its cover, and said, you can't be reading that offensive material in my presence. And he said, but wait, let me tell you, it's not a racist book, it's the opposite of that. It's anti-racist. She wouldn't hear it. And so she got him charged with racial harassment. And he asked his affirmative action office, grievance officer in his union, I'm just trying to read this book, and she doesn't want me to read the book. And he's with a cover like that, who would not agree with her? And so the affirmative action office also agreed, yep, he was guilty of racial harassment for reading a book with an offensive cover in the presence of a coworker who felt offended. So that really is judging a book by its cover. And we see people put up posters for, one poster was for a book called Why the Left Hates America. He was charged with hate speech for that. There was a kind of libertarian book called It's Okay to Leave the Plantation. The idea is that the government is kind of taking the role of kind of plantation owner, and so the idea is government is as bad as old plantation owners. So again, not a racist book by any means, kind of quite the opposite. And a student was charged again with disrupting an event because students saw him putting up the poster and said, "You can't be putting up that poster around us." So again, instead of having your first idea be, "No, you can't do that. We need to get you punished for that. You need to shut that speech down." Have the idea, "All right, so explain to me why you put that up. Defend what you've just done, and then be willing to be in an argument with me. And if you're not, I'll call you out for not being willing to argue. But then I'll just go on my way." The easiest way to avoid speech you don't like is to avert your eyes. Right? If you don't like what I'm saying, you can just leave. You don't have to stay. All right, one more example, and then we'll talk about ISU speech codes. And I can't quite see how much time I have. Doing great. All right, Hines Community College, Jackson, Mississippi. The largest community college in Mississippi. They have a football team. They act just like a four-year college with all the kinds of different resources they have. A student, 29 years old, father of two, EMT, had been up all night saving lives. He did a really bad job on his paper for his communication course because he had been up all night, and he wanted to speak to the professor after class to explain to her why he had gotten this bad grade. He didn't think he needed to get a better grade. He didn't really say, "I have an excuse, give me a better grade." Instead, his argument was going to be, "I just want to let you know I'm normally a good student, but this particular paper, I'm sorry I did a bad job on it." So he's waiting for his turn. It's after class. Professor, here's the thing about free speech. The context matters, right? So in this context, I'm the speaker, and it's pretty much not your place to speak for 45 minutes. It's my place to speak for 45 minutes. If I'm the professor and you're in the class, I get to decide who can speak, when they speak, how long they speak, the topic that they speak on, and then I can say, "You're done speaking. We're going to move on to somebody else." I'm the professor. I control my classroom. Once class is over, it's not my classroom anymore. So this student at Hines Community College was waiting for his turn to talk to the professor after class, and she was still kind of at the podium talking to another student, and he was maybe like where that door is, 6, 7 feet away, and he's talking to another student, and he says, "That grade's going to F up my GPA." He used the real word. I might be on TV. So she overhears him and says, "You can't be saying that word in my presence. You have detention." And he says, "You can't give me detention. This is college. I'm 29 years old. I have kids. You can't give me detention." So she says, "You're going to the dean." So the next day he has to go to the dean and defend himself. And to make that long story short, he finds himself charged with disrupting the class to the degree that the professor thinks she can't have him in class anymore at all. He just needs to be excluded from the class. Now, the other funny thing about Hines, now you may like swearing or not like swearing. The Supreme Court says one man's profanity or vulgarity is another man's lyric. And you actually know from music you might listen to that that's actually the case. But again, First Amendment protection extends to a student swearing after class, even if it's in the classroom. If it's after class, First Amendment rights have kind of kicked back in. And again, unethical, immoral, if you think that's fine. But the college also has an anti-swearing policy, whereas the first time you swear, it's a $25 fine, and you get demerits. They're on a demerit system. And the second time you swear, it's $50, and the third time you swear, you're suspended. And it's blatantly, amazingly unconstitutional. Eventually, they're going to have to abandon that when they go after the wrong person. Fire wins all of these cases. So in cases like this, we write a letter to the president and say, you're violating the First Amendment. Don't you want to be the kind of place? Again, we do this. This is, again, making your campus a free speech zone. You say, don't you want to be the kind of place that lets people have freedom to express whatever they want to express, especially on a college campus? And that almost always works. Now, part of it, too, is we say, take 2 or 3 weeks and think about it. Come back to us and let us know your side of the story. Maybe we got our facts wrong. Correct us. But if we're right, we're also going to be right about the First Amendment, and you've got to fix it, and you've got 2 or 3 weeks to figure it out, and we can either do a national press release which says Hines Community College loves free speech and solve the problem of this professor, or Hines Community College hates free speech and continues to violate the rights of students. So if you're the president of the college, what are you going to choose? A university or a college is not going to keep doing in public what it tries to get away with in private. This principle works for high school just as well as college, as you know if you heard the students from Colorado, or any case basically from the Student Press Law Center, right? As soon as you let people know that the rights of students are being violated, citizens actually have a pretty good nose for violations of rights. Again, it's part of just being a rational being a human being with human dignity. You know when somebody's rights are violated if it's core constitutional rights. Now, around the edges, it's more difficult. And so in Mississippi, swearing is not really liked very much in the general community. So unlike most other parts of the country that I've spoken in, we got a lot of people in Jackson saying, I would have expelled that student. He's never going to get a job with me. Right? So social pressure still works really well in that community. My guess is a lot of people in Jackson don't swear. And it's not because the government is going to crack down on them, but it's because they don't want the community to not like them. But in the same way, a university that violates freedom of speech of its own faculty members or students still has a place in the community, and it doesn't want that bad reputation of being known as a big rights violator. So that's very effective. You don't have to sue your school, although it sometimes works, but it takes a really long time. Like the student at Valdosta is still in court, and his case began in 2007. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of money, which you may not have. You may not get pro bono or free representation. It's trouble. Instead, make the moral argument. Say, don't you want to be the kind of place that values free speech? If you heard Frank Lamonti earlier, he said, well, look, don't you want to be the kind of place that does better than minimum, that instead of being the worst that you can possibly be on free speech because the law lets you, don't you want to offer, how about more rights than citizens have off campus instead of fewer? So I think that really does work. And I have a lot more examples, but we're going to move on. Let me just give you one more because it's an Iowa example. In 2008, do you know where Southwestern College is? They have a bunch of campuses to your southwest. And there is a Western Civ professor who was teaching Western Civ, and I guess it was early in the semester, and he got to the Adam and Eve story in Genesis and said, you know, this is a myth. And there were very deeply Christian students in his class who didn't like hearing his academic point of view that the Adam and Eve story is just a myth. Or even, you don't even have to say just, a myth that helps people understand who they are or helps people of the religion understand their religion. And so they complained about him. And the professor was told in a phone call, there are students who complained about the thing you said and you're fired. And that was the end of it. And so the American Humanist Association got involved because this is an idea that they actually share. And so, you know, we're nonpartisan. So even people who hate free speech have free speech, and we're going to defend them. A lot of organizations will defend the people whose views they like, and so they're kind of fair weather friends. So I'm not saying that about the AHA because we haven't had to go up against them sometime, but the AHA did go to bat for the professor, and so did FIRE. We helped him with his case. So the students basically had threatened to sue the school if the professor wasn't fired. Well, then the professor threatened to sue the school if he weren't rehired. So now the school's in a bind. Get sued one way or get sued the other way. So finally, they figured out what we can do is we just pay off the professor. And so the students are happy, the professor is happy enough. But what a bad situation for free speech if that's the way you solve your free speech problems on campus, by firing the professors and then paying them off. All right, now let's talk about Iowa State since we're here. We talked about sexual harassment as one of the most common ways that a university will have a policy that violates freedom of speech. Now look, sexual harassment is not protected speech, right? Now if I start saying all kinds of things that are protected actually are sexual harassment, well, that's not fair. You can't make sexual harassment policy so broad that it encompasses normal protected speech, like drawing something on a whiteboard. What the Supreme Court said is that in the educational context, any kind of discriminatory harassment, peer against peer, where there's not a power differential involved. It's just people where you live and eat and sleep and study, just in your normal everyday life where you're living for 6 years of your life. In that kind of normal context, something doesn't become harassment until it's conduct, and speech can become conduct for sure. conduct that is so severe and pervasive and objectively offensive and subjectively offensive to the victim that it has the effect of harassment, that it effectively limits your equal opportunity to an education, and it's directed at the victim because of their protected status. So that's a lot of prongs to fit. It's got to be conduct, it has to be severe enough, pervasive enough, objectively offensive enough, and subjectively offensive enough to the victim that it actually has the effect of giving them an unequal educational experience, limiting their education because of who they are. And that's what the Supreme Court said harassment is. Now, you may not like that standard. You might think it's too strict. You might not think it's strict enough. But the Supreme Court thought that this is the definition that they wanted to have, that maximally protected people living their everyday life and maximally protected true victims of sexual harassment. And the Office for Civil Rights has been kind of trying to figure out how much they like that definition too. And they basically have said, yes, the Davis standard is okay. It's not the way we would have worded it. And the thing that we're really focusing on is the effect. So if something is bad enough that it gives someone an unequal educational experience because of who they are, I mean, that's harassment. So they kind of want to do away with those prongs kind of by a more reasonable person standard. Well, if it's harassment and anybody would have been harassed in that situation, okay. But to really fully protect free speech, you need to have all those prongs in there. So what does ISU have in their discrimination and harassment policy? I'm going to read it. ISU prohibits harassment, which can be a form of discrimination if it is unwelcome and is sufficiently severe or pervasive so as to substantially interfere with a person's work or education. So you can hear that that's not so bad in itself because it really focuses on that effect. It doesn't have all the prongs, but it's not great. But then there's the examples list. So here's the thing about an examples list. Anything that you do or say can become harassment if you do it severely and pervasively and offensively enough. So if I call you on the phone at 7 p.m. and say, aren't you a great person? You're trying to get a good education. You're great. And you say, thanks very much. And then I call you later that night at 3 in the morning. All right, so far I haven't harassed you, right? Then I call you at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I say, you know, you really are great, aren't you? And don't you love free speech? And you came to this event. You're just so great. And you say, well, thanks, but it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, stop calling me so often, especially not at 3. And then I call you the next night at 3 in the morning, and I say, you know, I just wanted to remind you how great I think you are for loving free speech. And then you say, you know, if you call me another time after this, I'm just going to have to get you charged with harassment. You're harassing me. And then I call you the next time, right? I've harassed you. Normal, everyday speech telling you how great you are for liking the First Amendment became harassment because of the context. It's the time, the place, the manner, and the overall circumstances. So the thing with an examples list is, well, if you do it badly enough, it's bad. If you do it like a normal person does it, it's normal. So you don't want to have those examples in the policy suggesting to students that the first time they do it, or if they ever do it, it's already harassment. And so that's kind of really the problem here with your policy. It says harassment can include pranks, jokes, epithets, derogatory comments, vandalism or verbal, graphic, or written conduct. Written conduct is weird. And then the rest of the definitions is pretty good. So pranks, jokes, epithet, like who here has told a joke that has something to do with race, ethnicity, sex, pregnancy, color, religion, national origin, physical or mental disability, age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, or U.S. veteran status? If you've never told any jokes about any of those things in any way, you're okay, according to ISU. But if you have discriminatorily harassed someone, according to this policy. So we give this one a red light. We rate all these policies on our website green, yellow, or red. Green means it might be a restriction on speech, but it's an okay restriction. There are exceptions. If you really harass someone, that's not okay. Yellow light, probably unconstitutional, but not a clear and substantial violation of free speech. Red light, clear and substantial violation. So that one's red light. And you have a bunch of other similar policies. Here's one example. Another examples list from another part of the policy. Unwelcome sexual flirtations. Well, how do you know it's unwelcome until you try? And inappropriate put-downs. Right, so the first time you unwantedly or unwelcomely flirt with someone, it's not harassment. But if they tell you to cool it and you keep sticking around and like 10 minutes later you're still bugging them, it's becoming a little bit more pervasive. It's not really all that severe necessarily. It is directed at you because of who you are, especially because they're using the word sexual flirtations. It's becoming closer to harassment. And if the person tells you to stop and then they see you in the bar the next day and you do it again, you're starting to run afoul of this policy. So, again, you shouldn't put normal things that people do in everyday life and say in everyday life into your examples part of the policy. Also, they ban inappropriate put-downs of individual persons or classes of people. Inappropriate put-downs? Does that mean you can't say bad things about your elected officials or about administrators or about your professor or about people who are part of the group that you don't like? If you don't like the atheist group or the atheist group doesn't like your religious group, you can't have, right, if it's an inappropriate put-down, you're already harassing someone. That can't be what the marketplace of ideas is like. Fight bad speech with better speech. If you think something was inappropriate, tell them how inappropriate they were. Don't go to the university and say, this person harassed me, for all the reasons I said before. I just have a few more examples. Free speech zones, since we're talking about the actual physical presence of free speech zones. We give this one at ISU a yellow light, and it's because you need to tell the university ahead of time if you want to exercise your free speech. You need to kind of get a license to have your free speech. And I can go through the details of why that is if you're interested. But you don't need a license. You don't need special permission to exercise your free speech somewhere on campus, but whether it's in or outside the free speech zone. The whole problem with free speech zones, as applied to students and faculty members, people who have a right to be on campus expressing yourselves anyway, is that you're in a public forum atmosphere when you're in the sidewalks and the green areas of campus. You're in a place where you're expected to be exercising your free speech as the educational mission requires. That's part of what you're supposed to be doing. The message of a free speech zone is the opposite of that. It's, well, most of campus is a censorship zone, and so if you really want to express your beliefs or your views, go off to this part of campus where only a small number of people are going to have a chance to hear you. Don't wander around too much. So the idea of free speech zones is in itself a problem, and then ISU doesn't do a great job either in the actual policy. And then you have some internet usage policies that are also problematic, which we give a yellow light to. Sending unsolicited email messages. So does that mean that you can't write anyone an email unless you know ahead of time that they wanted to get your email? You can't say, dear Professor so-and-so, I'd like to take your class. It was unsolicited, right? So not so good. It doesn't clearly and substantially violate free speech because it's not a wide variety of speech. There are a lot of alternative means of reaching that professor, but it's still bad enough that we give it a yellow light. Another one, here's what your acceptable use policy for, say, call it the internet. A lot of these acceptable use policies date back 10 or 20 years and haven't really been updated. So here's what your acceptable use policy says is harassment. Engaging in harassment via email, telephone, or paging, whether through language, frequency, or size of messages. I don't understand what a size of message would be by paging, like how that could possibly be harassment, right? So if you're not reaching severe, pervasive, objectively offensive, you're not getting anywhere close to that. So yellow light. So what can you do about these violations of free speech? And then we have about 15 minutes for questions. Well, one of them is to know your rights. A good way to do that, especially if you're a journalist, SPLC website. Go to FIRE's website. We have free guides that you can download and read online. They're not that long. Know what the First Amendment even says. Congress shall make no law. And know that it applies to you as a public university or public high school student. You have your full First Amendment rights on campus. Again, guided by specific exceptions, when you're in class or other places. Then exercise your rights. Go to the free speech zone and then go outside the free speech zone and see if anyone gets you in trouble, right? Say the things that you need to say that might be offensive and really have those conversations and fight back when some administrator says, oh, we need to punish those people. Say, no, we're the community. We know how to fight our own battles. We're strong enough. So there's the know your rights, exercise them, and then defend them. You can sign up for FIRE's Campus Freedom Network. We have a sign-up sheet in the back. Please do that. You get only a couple of emails that are solicited, and you will find out about FIRE's cases. And if you like feeling outraged at abuses of free speech, there's no better place to be than on FIRE's mailing list. So thanks very much. I'm going to take questions, criticisms, comments, whatever you like.
And if you have a question, come up to the microphone, so don't be bashful.
And if you need to leave early, just feel free to go. I never asked the people in the back if you could hear me, but no one ever acted like they didn't, so we're good. Right? So on the hate speech question, this is one that comes up so often, right? People say hate speech isn't free speech. Does someone in this room have that view? No one has it. So it's hard to argue when everyone has it, right? So surround yourself with people who disagree with you, and you'll learn something, right? Okay. The Phelpsians, okay to picket 1,000 feet from a military funeral? Anyone who says no, it's not okay? All right, this is a hard audience. We're going to have to do the KKK example then. KKK rally comes to campus. Protected speech. Wow, okay.
I thought that the Phelps thing was kind of
Okay, go ahead. Say more.
well, I mean, it could eventually be called harassment or something, right?
All right, so the question is, at what point does speech like the Phelpsians' speech become unprotected? Because there's a lot of exceptions, not that many, but enough, other than harassment, right? So one of the things the government can do to punish you is to let the person who thought they were hurt by you sue you. That's a tort, right? And so intentional infliction of emotional distress through negligence, or right? We're going to get into this in the next session, and so if you're interested in that, definitely stay. Well, if you're 1,000 feet away and the person who is distressed didn't even know you were there until they saw you on the news later, and you didn't actually use their name or their family's name, and they just found out that you were there because you wanted some publicity, and you don't even really know who these people are, and they don't really know who you are, have you really been caused emotional distress by their intentional act to hurt you? I'm going to leave that as a question mark because we have to get into that later on the panel, right? So did they incite anyone to violence? Did they incite anyone to actually go to the church, the Catholic church where the funeral was? Did they basically say, all right, all of you who agree with us, which was maybe nobody, let's go now and show them who's boss? No, they didn't do that. Did they intimidate? Did they say, if you have this funeral, we're going to throw a rock through the window, so you can't have it? They didn't do that, right? So there are things that they could have done, but they didn't do any of those things, according to most of the people who evaluated the case from a legal perspective, except a bunch of attorneys general, almost all of them for the states, right? So they had to have some other argument. So I hope we get into that in the next session, because 50 of the top lawyers in the country for the states thought that the Supreme Court should have done the other thing. So it's a real debate. I didn't really answer your question because the answer comes later.
I got a question that may feed into that. The Klan, let's say the Klan decides to have a rally at a historically African-American college or university, and it leads to a riot, violence.
All right.
What do you think that would do to the administration
Right.
with that university?
Right. Good question. So and this happens actually, the similar kind of question comes more often in grade schools too. So we'll start with the grade schools example, right? So if people are saying normally protected speech, but because of the tensions in the campus, it frequently has been leading to fights breaking out, then the school actually has a realistic interest in stopping those fights from breaking out, protecting students from one another, and can say, well, those gang symbols are just not going to be allowed anymore, right? So otherwise they would be allowed, but now they're not. And so it's a little bit different once everybody is an adult, right? So what you do is you say, well, look, we're all adults here on this campus. We have a lot of ways to fight back. And the people who are fighting, the people who are causing violence, are the ones who made the mistake. And so we need to protect people from the violence. Now, some of the corollaries of that are you can't commit violence against someone just to shut them up and say, well, that's called the heckler's veto, right? You say, oh, Adam Kissel is coming to speak, so I'm going to call in a bomb threat. Well, the right thing to do after you make sure there's no bomb is you say, all right, we're going to have lots of extra security to protect that speaker. We're not going to shut down the speech because the most intolerant person in the neighborhood tried to get that to not happen. But then you also can't charge the speaker for all the extra security. That's one of the basic roles of the state, is to protect its citizens from violence, right? So, but if you know that there's a high likelihood of violence, now that changes the analysis, because now you might say, all right, you need to show ID to get into this particular event, because we're going to limit it to only the people who we know are the least violent, and the people who have the most right to be there are the students. All right, and if you don't normally have a right to be on campus, you're a third party, well, you, in a lot of jurisdictions, don't have the same rights, or they're diminished. So from now on, we're going to actually say the only people who can go onto campus to express their views are people who have paid good money to be there, or faculty, staff, and students. Right? So the university does have some things it can do. Now, if there's, like, say, a KKK club on campus, which there's not going to be at an HBCU, I don't think, right? Well, they have a right to be on campus and do their thing. And if fights are breaking out because of that, then the university has to figure out how to keep people separate from each other while still letting people express themselves. And again, they might have to have buffer zones, right? So, like, you know, if it's an abortion clinic, a buffer zone is okay. If it's a military funeral, that hasn't really been litigated so far as I know, but maybe somebody else does. You know, if it's a college classroom, or just, let's not call it a classroom, it's regular everyday stuff happening in college, you don't really need a buffer zone, because most of the time people are not breaking out into fights. That was a good question. Dylan.
I was just wondering, for kind of perspective, could you talk a little bit about the difference between speech codes in other countries, maybe like Canada or European countries that don't necessarily have the First Amendment, and maybe the difference between the two?
It's a great question to which I really have a very minimal knowledge. You know, one of the things that I try to do is practice what I preach about, intellectual humility, and I just really don't know about most other countries at all. The countries I do know a little bit about are Canada and some European Union countries. And the First Amendment really is unusual in that it really protects us in a way that most countries do not protect their citizens' speech. But there is something special about the American university system, and I think it is no coincidence that people want to come to American universities, that they really think the unthinkable and mention the unmentionable, and feel like they can pursue any thought they might have, partly because it's in the United States. So we really are leading rather than following on this. And let me tell you a story about something that happened in Canada, which could happen in the United States too, because I just told you all these stories, and they do happen. A pro-life group wanted to have some kind of event on campus, and they were told by the university basically, oh, that issue has been settled, so our side won, the pro-choice side won, so you can't have your event. And that was the end of it. And then they ended up getting arrested because they had it anyway. And they've been in court, and I don't know how that's turned out. So, you know, the libel laws also differ from country to country, and we're pretty good, right? So if you say something that's false against someone, and it's really defamatory, that's not protected. If it's true, it's protected. If I know that you have a terrible disease and murdered someone, and I tell people about it, you might be able to have a tort against me, but you don't have libel against me. So I should just stop the answer there, because that's pretty much all I know.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much, Adam, for coming this morning. And of course, Adam will be back at 4:45 when we have our roundtable on Snyder versus Phelps. But before we take a 10-minute break, bathroom break, water break, soda break, whatever, We want to give Adam a Champion of the First Amendment award and thank him so much for coming today. All right, 10-minute break, and then we'll have put on.